being on the left really interferes with my socialist politics.
Hi again. This is Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast, at the end of history. The period in which Western liberal democracy was held to be the final form of human government is now over. We're charting what's emerging and what comes next. Produced from Brazil and the UK, we scan the globe to understand the politics, economics, and culture of the new era. Today we're talking to the writer Amber Ali Frost about the limitations of liberal feminism, about victimhood and confessional writing, and about the deeply unfashionable topic of parenting. Alright, so welcome everyone. I'm Alex Hochuli. We are very pleased to have Amber Ali Frost with us today. Also here are Alpha Bunga Bunga regulars and co-producers, George Hoare in London and Ben Fogel, who's also in London this time.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Amber, I wanted to firstly ask you, we all know feminism means a million different things today. It's probably the most misrepresented and travestied political position in contemporary politics, certainly in the United States, in Britain, and perhaps elsewhere. So as a starting point, what do you see for yourself, like the headline differences between the sort of socialist feminism you'd advocate and more mainstream, lean-in, liberal corporate feminism?
I think you all know the answer to that question.
We have to start somewhere.
Yeah. For me, I'm pretty Firestonian about this stuff. She was a loon, but she was right about some things, or Ingalls, if you would prefer. I see women as a category that originated with a biological sexual dimorphism that has produced a pre-capitalist division of labor. And from there, we got all kinds of insane stuff, like culturally and economically. And my solutions to this are highly economistic. I don't particularly connect with most of the popular feminist discourse right now because it's mostly sort of social or cultural or about representation. Those questions are obviously interesting, on a micro level, when you want to talk shit with the girls or whatever. But for me, feminism has always been interesting as a political problem, as an economic challenge. The problem I had is that earlier I was sort of more interested in sort of the gender stuff, the cultural stuff. And basically, when I started reading about, things like, domestic labor and divisions of labor in the home and stuff like that, I figured out pretty quickly that those questions aren't really interesting anymore because we know how to fix them. We figured it out. We cracked the code, like in the 70s. Like we figured it out. It's just like a comprehensive welfare state, lots of free time, modern homes with modern technology. And in some places, like a little bit of affirmative action regarding things like male parenting. So it's almost a strange thing to be sort of a socialist and a feminist now because you kind of know what we have to do. You just end up repeating yourself over and over again.
Well, I think like the prevailing liberal thought is that this stuff has been done, I guess, or that even changing these material relationships, the culture still stands, right? It's a sort of like a very idealistic view of society where even if you change women's roles in societies, it won't really change because there's still this culture that holds people in, that men will still act like assholes and that women will still be objectified, and that can't change and that won't change, or that will only change through some sort of culture warrior approach to politics.
Yeah, but even if you believe that, what is the foundation for altering a culture? Like, if you don't have any leverage, how do you change culture? I mean, obviously, like, you need major political shifts in order to. I mean, there's a reason why we're in the gender situation that we're in at the moment. It's not completely arbitrary. And I don't understand why people think that they can make gains on a political problem without politics. It's worked in kind of, it's worked to a point. And I do wish feminists were more honest about that. But at some point, obviously, you hit a wall. I remember I was like very early, and as a socialist, I was like head of like some youth feminist caucus or whatever in Democratic Socialists of America, and we were talking to these kind of old guard second wavers, just like these wonderful women from like Chicago Women's Liberation Union and trade unionists or whatever. And, they were asking us sort of these like very serious practical questions that, we didn't necessarily consider, that were just sort of, good organizational HR. They're like, well, can women join this organization without immediately getting hit on or ignored or whatever? Do they join as members? Is it expected that they're going to be contributors and participants? Are they tokenized, that kind of thing? And they were interesting questions, and we kind of found that, yeah, there's one or two leches and, the sort of things you would expect. But by the end of it, this woman, she kind of like broke her professionalist kind of facade. She's like, I just have to say, I think it's so great what you girls are doing. She's like, men are so different now. She's like, men now, they like do dishes and they like change diapers. And she's like, it didn't used to be like that at all. And I think it's kind of silly to act like we haven't made a lot of advances on the social level. It's just that without an economic project behind that, you're going to reach a point, you're going to reach the limit of that. It doesn't matter how, woke your boyfriend is or whatever. Fundamentally, the problem isn't something that can be solved, through some kind of enlightenment or consciousness raising problem.
Well, like whenever I kind of have this discussion, and I'll propose, well, to the extent that I am a feminist, I wouldn't define myself as a male feminist, because everyone who does seems to be absolute human trash.
Yeah.
But you go, well, look, I'm all in favor of free universal childcare for women, right to abortion and these things. And there's a kind of, I don't know, whenever I have these arguments, a kind of sneering response like, yeah, of course you would say that, but you're not really taking the problem seriously. Often in these discussions, liberal feminists will be outright dismissive of actual practical material changes which would liberate women, as if it's, just some mere practical issue which doesn't get to the heart of the real issue, which is a cultural one.
I mean, I think we need to be perfectly honest about the fact that liberal feminism as a project is antithetical and hostile to the socialist project. I have zero tolerance for these women. Just zero tolerance.
I mean, to add on to that, one of the things I particularly have seen over the last few years with the sort of, I guess people call it new wave of feminism, and particularly in left-wing academic cultural spaces, is sort of like the rise of like ironic misandry as a way of doing business, or something which is like seen as cool and social value. Yeah. What do you think is behind that? I mean, it's something I've already noticed when I came to the US. It's sort of spread everywhere now. But like, is there something driving that? Is this an entry of liberal feminism into left spaces, or something else?
So I think what happened, and this is a very loose survey of kind of popular feminist thought or whatever, is around 2014, people saw the crack showing in kind of a like libertine, sex positive, everyone's just having a good time sort of feminism. I think Ariel Levy wrote about it in Female Chauvinist Pigs, which is a really dated book, but is like very much a good portrait of that time. And this idea of libertinism and like entrepreneurialism and all of these things, it's like that we're very much the rallying cries of kind of an early 2000s feminism. And around 2014, people were like, actually, this shit sucks. It has not been very helpful. It's not, seen to a lot of our major complaints with regards to being a woman. So people actually started revisiting, I think, very smart, very strange feminists that, I like that people started reading, for example, Valerie Solanas again, who was a loon, but I think wrote very fascinatingly about the suburbs, very insightfully about kind of like atomized suburban life. She also like wanted to kill men. So, you take the good with the bad. Or like Andrea Dworkin, who never really gets credit for being a very like thoughtful person. There was a slight reinvigoration of Shulamith Firestone, mostly because she died, and people were like, "Oh, there was this crazy wild woman who was this, this Inglesist. She developed that theory of the family much further, and she went in a lot of strange directions. But also, she tried to take that line of thinking to its natural conclusion. And so, in that, they kind of did a sort of I don't know what you would call it. I forget what it's called in the humanities, but like a cultural like retrieval project. Like basically they tried to sort of like rehab like people like Solanas and Dworkin a little bit. And so it started out as this kind of cheeky, like actually these women are smart and they said some interesting things. I think a lot of people were also lying about actually having read them, but
they read the Tumblr posts.
Yeah. They read the Tumblr posts.
I saw someone on the train today reading the Scum Manifesto. So it's
so fun. It's such a fun read. And like there's some actually smart insights about it. But I think that curve to like, the kill all men, male tears thing, which is very weird because it started out as a joke. Like so many things on the internet, it was like this tongue-in-cheek thing. But are you familiar with the term irony poisoning?
Yes.
Okay.
Explain that to us for listeners who don't know.
Basically,
and I don't know.
You make a joke about something that you are perhaps ambivalent about or has like a kernel of truth, but you're uncomfortable confronting the reality of it. So you make the joke and you make the joke and you make the joke, and eventually you can't tell if you're kidding or not. And that's what happened. I mean, to me, the misandry thing was when feminists got irony poisoning. And to me, it's just completely absurd. It's just bullshit bourgeois women, like complaints about their shitty men, which I'm sure their men are shitty. But
I mean, it's what happens when you date male feminists.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I'm sorry, you made your bed. But like,
well, maybe he made the bed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, he starched the sheets.
That was his moral offsetting.
Yeah.
He's an asshole, but he did the sheets, So.
Yeah.
He did the sheets so he can white knight in them.
So it became this kind of thing where a lot of middle class women's, were deeply unhappy. And I think a lot of this is also associated with the generational thing where there was incredibly high unemployment post 2008, especially. They had nothing to do but look at Tumblr all day because they didn't have fucking jobs. And they kind of misapprehended the problem. And it's because that's superficially, guys being shitty is much more easily articulated than I'm extremely alienated. And the role that men have in my life has an outsized influence on what it should, because I'm not economically independent, because I'm not secure. So yeah, this misandry thing happened. And for me, it was just like, oh my God, I never really had a problem with men. I had a problem with bosses. Like, it's just that so many bosses are men. Like to them it became a distinction without a difference, but to me it's like, no, that's an aesthetic, arbitrary sort of diagnosis of the problem. And I think any woman who's ever had a female boss, I mean, the fact that so many women hated Hillary Clinton should have been an indicator that most women aren't sitting around diagnosing their problems as individual men or groups of men being the source of them. And I'm pretty staunch on this as well, for like bourgeois women in any kind of liberal democracy, for all its flaws, like there is no patriarchy. Like it's just extremely difficult to actually do that. You'd have to be on like a Mormon cult or something. It's not that you don't experience sexism. And I used to be kind of fast and loose with the term patriarchy. I was like, well, whatever, it's shorthand. I've hardened up a lot on on terminology. I do actually now believe that don't call something fascist if it's not fascist. Don't call something white supremacist if it's not white supremacist. Don't call something patriarchy if it's not patriarchy, because those things have specific prescriptions. And if you don't diagnose it correctly, you're not going to get the right prescriptions.
Yeah, you completely evacuate them from meaning. And one thing that I liked about your piece, which we'll come on to discuss a little bit later, but that you do make reference to kind of a personal anecdote when you go, no, this is real patriarchy. It kind of made me laugh.
Right. Well, I came to this conclusion talking with a friend of mine, Jennifer Pan, who has written about white nationalist movements. And she grew up in the 90s in Idaho during the height of the militia movement.
Yeah, all they have there is like, potatoes, one like okay college football team, and dudes with guns in the hills.
Exactly. And I'm from Indiana, which was the second wave of the KKK, and we just kept reading people talking about like white supremacy, and they just kept saying white supremacy to call all these things. And she's like, do you ever feel weird about this? Because we've been exposed to literal white supremacists. And I'm like, yeah, maybe this isn't helpful. And it's just, if you've seen an actual white supremacist calling like a TV show for having like poor representation, whatever that means, white supremacist, is so fucking laughable. And if you've been exposed to literal patriarchy, calling sexist jokes patriarchy it's just, come on, grow up.
Well, I guess it might also have the effect of people rejecting abstractions altogether, right? Because if you experience patriarchy as literally your father or your husband keeping you at home and not letting you out, then talking about a sexist joke being patriarchy is like, well, that just seems so abstract. That must be bullshit. Like that term must be bullshit.
Right. You would say that, it doesn't exist at all. And it's like, no, I mean, it exists, for like economically dependent women. It exists in weird kind of, like insular conservative communities as well. But I mean, I'm very much with Marx on this. Capitalism has been a mixed bag, but women entering the workforce has, but there are perks, and there were perks to women entering the workforce.
Yep.
Sometimes we like died in fires and stuff, but
got you out of the house.
It did change labor relations on, within the domestic sphere.
Right, so let's change tack a little bit, and I'm going to pass over to George, actually, who wanted to delve deeper into the question of confessional writing, in reference specifically to something that you've written on this.
Right. Yeah, so I thought your point just now, this idea that you kind of think that you can make gains on a political problem without politics. I think that definitely resonated, and it's sort of the piece here, Confession Booth: The Trouble with the Trauma Industry. Rereading this just today, really interesting how this was this kind of college rape moral panic ended up being one of the precursors in some ways of the Me Too movement.
Right.
So maybe
another category of women too, like that are in no way like statistically more likely to be sexually assaulted. Generally, these safer women. It's like college students, movie stars, like women in like elite media spaces. Like this entire spectacle has been completely focused. Like it honestly, it's disgusting to me, because the impression I get is that, well, some rapes are more tragic than others.
So I guess there's a question behind all this as well around liberal feminism, and why why do you think it has as this characteristic mode of argument the appeal to personal experience? I think the notion is often presented that having experienced something puts you in a privileged position to understand it and to talk about it. And this seems to be quite a central plank of the contemporary kind of liberal feminist project.
Well, I mean, this might be a little bit cynical, but I'm pretty vulgar Marxist about this. I think standpoint theory was very advantageous to, women and minorities trying to make their way into the academy and, having to basically justify their own work. And if you can say, like, actually, I'm an authentic voice, then, people are more inclined to listen to you, or at least pretend like they're listening to you because it's a novelty. Mm-hmm. I think the prevalence of standpoint theory is just incredibly. I think it's due to just the economic marketplace of the university. Everyone needs an edge. So if you trot out your identity, that's an edge, And
authenticity, that idea, I mean, it definitely gives some intellectual weight behind what you're saying that can't always be countered with rational argument. Right. And that's actually,
that got pushed forward during the 90s as well, during the height of authenticity is king. It was a confluence with a lot of other kind of social phenomenon and cultural phenomenon as well.
Mm. So one thing that I found really striking was when you talk about what you call survivor memoirs, and you sort of say they can be highly resistant to critique by virtue of their pathos. So they have this carapace of trauma, as you call it, around them. And this reminded me of this idea of cynical reason put forward by people like Sloterdijk and Zizek, which basically says it's impossible to critique some contemporary ideological claims because if you point out that they're a lie, that aftershave won't really make you irresistible to women, then the response is like, what, you believe that? You're an idiot. So I guess how is this insulation against criticism of, I guess, survivor memoirs specifically and this mode of argumentation in general? How's that different to this kind of cynical reason?
Also, I don't want to say that it's all entirely cynical. I think the industry itself is cynical, but also, I mean, the internet runs on female pain. Like, you get, a girl fresh out of NYU, she's 22 years old. Bustle says they'll give her $50 to write about the worst thing that ever happened to her. She thinks she's going to become a writer. Like, it's a fucking casting couch. It's really dark, bleak shit. And people they're not necessarily trying to get ahead, but they're like, this is the project. It's a therapeutic project. Feminism is now a therapeutic project. And that probably, it feels like you're doing something productive. And you kind of, flay yourself before the masses and let them see your guts. Because you're told that that's the good thing to do. And to me, the first thing that comes to mind when I think about like encouraging very intimate confession is like a cult. That sounds dramatic, I think, to some people, but if you've ever had an exposure to an extremely conservative insular church, there's a period where people say, okay, well, tell us everything that you did, and eventually making shit up. So, like,
it's also true of certain far left organizations.
Yeah. Well, I said cults.
Well,
I know what I said.
I'm sure anyone who's spent a significant amount of time in a fringe Maoist or Trotskyist organization knows all about this.
Of course. So I think it's become this kind of social coercion to just. It's a confluence of the kind of economic incentives behind it, and like a sort of form of social coercion that's formed around not just liberal feminism, but kind of a broad progressive movement.
And I guess there's an important element of that where it's sold as empowering as well, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, is it
crying in public is now sold as empowering? Which I mean, to me, is disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, is it too simple to say that it's just that the trauma industry basically functions by giving us all these lurid, prurient details of sexual assault, and it shocks us, whilst it basically sells to predominantly women an idea of empowerment, and giving them a bit of a paycheck from some of the organizations that you mentioned.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a confluence of things. You also can't deny the fact that people are titillated by this stuff. Like, there is something very lurid about again, this is why traditionally I've been very resistant to writing anything kind of memoiristic, or if I do, it's, about my devil-may-care adventures. Because people are drawn to that stuff for very kind of like lascivious reasons, and a lot of times they try and justify it with oh, this is so brave. This is so brave. And they get all this feedback from someone telling them they're brave, and it's like, how is it brave? It got like 20,000 retweets. Sounds like a good move on her part.
So I guess there's sorry, I think Ben,
yeah, this will come in here. So I think along with these new platforms, and I think it's also like part of it is a political economy of media, where it's as Amber mentioned, it's really cheap and easy to get views of confessional stories. I mean, like Vice and other publications really have pioneered this. Are we entering in a new phase of sort of like confessional writing and writing about trauma in the age of Me Too? And I think part of what I think is striking, especially in this current sort of like, year after it really began, and was that a lot of what we've seen in Me Too in some cases is a lack of institutional solutions to problems of sexual harassment and abuse within these places where they've been taking place, but instead the supposed cultural change.
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen very little mention of labor law changes, for example. And, when you mention this stuff, people look at you like you've, just denied the Holocaust or something. But you have to go straight to, okay, this is a problem. What do we do about it? But if you go to what do we do about it, people are like, look, we're having a moment here. And it's like, well, I don't really want to be a part of the moment. Your moment seems extremely unfun. I like to have a good time. For all the shitty things that have happened to me, I'm still largely very net positive about my life. And I don't know that this stuff is actually productive. I've talked to a few kind of, psychoanalysts about this, not like in a clinical setting, but just like friends who are like psychoanalytic Marxists. And I'm like,
over a couple beers.
Yeah. It can't be good for you to broadcast the worst thing that ever happened to you, receive tons of praise, and then inevitably, of course, a lot of criticism and scrutiny, and have that be like the foundation of your career. Your pain is your career. That's horrible. And they're like, oh no therapist would ever recommend that someone like still raw from a traumatic experience write a public memoir about it. Like that would be like unethical advice for a therapist to give.
Yeah, I think we also see this thing in cases of Me Too, when people have broadcast their experience. And I think this speaks to a lot about like some of these cultural issues and the way that not only are people's memories of experience often messy, but relationships get messy too. That people become so invested in these pure narratives of victimhood that when somebody's own sort of weird life history comes into the picture from somebody who has come forward as part of Me Too, it seems to a way of discrediting everything altogether. And you would think if it's really a movement, it shouldn't really matter about someone's individual narrative. And now, I don't want to mention names because it's such a shit show if one gets into like these celebrity duels. But in the essence, it's like people are so invested in having to protect the sanctity of a narrative of the person.
Right. And it's just incredibly shaky ground to build. I mean, you cannot build a political project to deal with and it is a political problem. I'm sorry. This is not an interpersonal thing. It's just, men are not walking around like frothing rapists all the time. I'm not interested in any kind of civilizing project with regards to feminism.
Although maybe at Yale frat houses.
Yeah, well, of course. Again, though, also a political problem. Burn it down. But like, it's you risk so much by just hanging these things on these horrible traumatic stories, because if something is unreliable or more complicated, it's immediately used to discredit the person. The example I remember coming up with was, are you aware of Tawana Brawley?
No.
Okay, so this was an American phenomenon, and it's from years ago. And this young woman came home, reported a gang rape by the police. This young black woman, a gang rape by the police. There was a huge media outcry for it. Like, I think Al Sharpton got involved, and all of these kind of, political player, just self-appointed community leaders, very cynical people. And they're like, we need justice for Tawana Brawley. They basically figured out that she had lied about this. However, in police reports about, and this does not get reported, about her home life, they found out that like her stepfather was he was abusive to her. But after they had found out she had lied about this, gang rape by the police, no one cared. And it was like this really terrible thing, because like this woman was being abused. There was a problem. People who say make up a gang rape, there's probably something happening to them, even if it's not the thing they say it is. So the entire investigation got shelved because everyone was so embarrassed about making a media spectacle around this one event that turned out to be fallacious. And like, those are the kinds of situations where it's just, we should be learning from these things. We should be learning that, turning women into like poster children is very fraught. It's unfair to women. It's unfair to the victims. And when, maybe they're troubled or fucked up or, just maybe not the ideal poster child, the whole campaign falls apart. And meanwhile, like, basically this woman had to go back to a home with an abusive stepfather no one would ever listen to her again. She was the girl who cried wolf, even though people witnessed, like just very creepy abusive behavior happening in the home. And what's already kind of happening with the Me Too stuff is that you're starting to see, whatever, everyone knows what I'm talking about. You're starting to see some of these women are crazy. That doesn't suggest there isn't a problem.
Yeah, but I guess if you make the only basis for argumentation, for legitimate argument, one's personal experience, and that does open you up to the possibility that people make stuff up, that people turn out to not be credible relators of their own story, and also just the fact that these stories might not be mutually intelligible to people. You can't really build a basis for solidarity on the basis of kind of very specific individual experiences.
Yeah, I think we've just seen this case of the Supreme Court nominations, is that one's partisan leanings make one view someone's experience, as credible as it sounds, in a different way. So one can easily countenance the idea that the experience happened in the case of the woman who came forward, but it was a doppelganger or something like that, if it's convenient to your narrative. Because you're actually just dodging the political question there altogether.
Yeah. Well, I think also there are people kind of involved in these media spectacles that, it's cyclical. It's not just Me Too. It's every kind of, cause du jour or whatever. It has mostly extremely earnest people who want to solve a problem and who are moved by other people's plights. But then it has, a bunch of chancers who, and those are the people that you're like, when you say, okay, well, what is the political solution to this? Because to me, the suggestion is obviously like labor law. And they look at you like you just said something awful because you're undermining their bottom line, which is to keep the spectacle going.
Talking about something which relates to personal experience, but which is obviously a much greater argument behind it, was your piece Daddy Issues, the soul of dad under socialism, which worked as a sort of defense of an article in Jacobin, It's Okay to Have Children, but also a kind of elaboration of it, which itself relies on a certain personal narrative, but really tries to...
I threw in memoir. I'm a huge hypocrite.
Oh, that's fine. You have to be, I think. But it's obviously effective because it isn't putting forward your own personal experience and leaving it on the table as if that's enough. It serves as a basis for actually making a political argument. And the question that it asks is, how can we transcend the left's subcultural squabbling? Something that we've discussed many times on this podcast over a variety of different episodes. So I guess, could you tell us a bit about the project and what was the impulse behind the article?
So basically, we'll go back to talking about everyone's media motivations. Basically, my column used to be an advice column, and I was getting too many questions about the same things. I would see the same problems over and over again, where people were sort of too, politically, intellectually, morally insecure to maybe voice their criticisms or skepticism of, like the liberal hysteria that you've talked about on your own show. So it's like, okay, well, let's just start writing regular essays. Let's make this a traditional essay kind of, polemic, etc. kind of thing. So I was kind of like, okay, should I write about like left organizing? Should I write about this? But then the Jacobin childhood issue came out, which I thought was just so fabulous because I love Jacobin. And I think they do a lot of good work, but they do kind of, and this is, I think, also the nature of being more of a journal than a magazine. They do kind of end up doing sort of an Antiques Roadshow thing where they're like, this is our 68 issue. And if you want to make socialism into something that's vibrant and relevant to people's lives, you can't Antiques Roadshow too much, in my opinion. So they had a childhood issue, which was so exciting because it's like, this is something that normal people care about. I care about Lenin, but that's because I'm weird. And a bunch of just cynical, absurd, ridiculous, anti-socialist feminists glommed onto the one article in it that was written by a man, which is, of course, edited by a woman, commissioned by a woman. The whole thing is just you cannot win with these people.
To add some clarification, Connor who wrote the article, has a column in every edition of Jacobin.
Yes, he's on the editorial board. Yeah. And it was just like, honestly, it's not even my favorite Connor article. Like it's like, hey, what if we had welfare for children and parents? Like it's like duh. But that is the kind of thing that I love reading in Jacobin, particularly because I love it when Jacobin puts out what I call the Jacobin article, which is problem ... and therefore socialism. And it gets a little dull and repetitive, but like I think that's what they're really good at. Just relentlessly finding the superficial problems that people are dealing with and being like, this is a problem of capitalism.
Well, especially when it's something which isn't often touched upon by a kind of atomized urbanite left, such as childcare, which is, Yeah.
Something that, just a huge number of people struggle with daily. Basically he wrote a defense of welfare for children, and there was a response that I think is a fundamentally anti-socialist response, which is, look, actually the real problem with raising children in America is that men don't step up. And I'm sorry, I've seen these men. They take care of babies. Like, that's not the issue I have with them. Like, it's just a ridiculously absurd suggestion. Because also all of these women, the ones that do have children, always brag about their whatever 4'2" baby Bjorn wearing ad executive boyfriend. It's like, yeah, that is what they're good for. But I don't think they're like that because they're particularly evolved or whatever that means. It's because they have good jobs and they can take time off and they have room to sort of expand into a more egalitarian form of parenting. So the only conclusion you can arrive at is that these women aren't talking about their men. They're talking about the men that I come from. Yeah,
it's a coded form of class loathing, right? That it's working class men who are the problem that need to be fixed.
Anti-masculinity is absolutely just reactionary, sneaky way of just hiding your contempt for working class people.
Do you think this also, kind of get mainstreamed in elements of the left through what we mentioned earlier, which is sort of this ironic misandry?
Yeah. I mean, again, how ironic is it at this point? It's an easy thing to lean on, and it's also the worst thing is that it's taken all of the joy out of. This is the worst thing, but one of the things I complain about with, my female friends is like, wow, they really took all the joy out of bitching about men. It used to be so fun. You just bust the balls and like.
Oh my God, that's a real dystopian conclusion.
Like take what you will from me, but not that. That's one of life's greatest joys.
Why does it take all the fun out? Because it's like all men are bad, so there's not anything particularly interesting about the specific ways in which these particular men are bad.
Yeah, well, and it overstates the problem. So then you are put in a position where you have to defend men. And it's like, don't make me do that. But you have to, because, I mean, if you defend the working class, there's some men there.
So just to pick up on this point about class, which I think comes through definitely in the article, just maybe something from the UK experience. Particularly in the noughties, there was a very clear erosion of the division between public and private, such that basically parenting and children, that was used as a way to attack various aspects of working class culture. Everything from diet to smacking became problematized on behalf of children. Children can't speak for themselves, so it was their interests are protected by these politicians to attack working class parents in the way they parent their children.
Yeah, and people don't love their children as much as we do. I love that one.
Yeah, and so it was
boarding school where they fucking never mind. I'll stop.
Yeah. No. I mean, but it was. I guess my question is, it was definitely part of a specific New Labour kind of petty authoritarian removal of civil liberties project. Does that
Oh wait, did you cut out?
Yeah, you cut out.
We're back.
Did Tony Blair come and snatch George away from us?
Yeah.
Oh no! I think that's what GCHQ. They draw the line on criticism of New Labour. You can say you're a Marxist, but you can't criticise.
You can't. Yeah, the
New
parenting
Labour's
policies, for example.
Peter
Mandelson was innocent.
Well, too, though, right? I mean, I almost originally the exact same thing happened in the U.S. and during about the same time. Well, a little earlier for us, but. I didn't really go into this, and I originally wrote this as just like this highly like data-driven kind of historical thing, and then I was just like, fuck it, I want people to actually read this, and also like I resented all the women just weaponizing their bad boyfriends to attack socialism, but it happened in the 90s where what we call welfare reform, which is a nice euphemism for, taking money away from poor families, was, of course, obviously pretty unpopular. People really, really relied on that money. And now that they don't have it, like it's had horrible effects. But what the bait and switch for that is like, well, the real problem is deadbeat dads. So those two policies were married. It's like, we're going to crack down on deadbeat dads. We're taking away your family welfare. We're taking away like check welfare no longer exists in America. Basically, we're taking that away, But we're going to go after the real problem, which is your shitty ex. Keeping in mind that, I don't know, that like unemployment, none of that stuff was taken into account. And like, I know this very well. Like, you know, my dad was in and out of work all the time. So half the time he couldn't work. And even when he did, he was just kind of a loon and wasn't reliable or whatever. So, you know, this is married to a neoliberal policy. And I just don't think you can support, you know, like a nuclear family model of economics and not be a reactionary.
I guess it comes back again and again to taking political problems and repackaging them as personal grievances, as personal difficulties. Yeah. And it's been a very, you know, from Thatcher, who you start with start your article by quoting, you know, it's been a very successful project, I think, in the UK and the US. But you
there is no society. There are just families. I mean, that's.
I think what also you see now is that there's also like this deep historical pessimism that's tied to the individualization of narratives that like people think that things can't really change, and that's kind of like crept into the sort of like failure of collective action, failing group identity and building solidarity networks. And you see this, I think this is part of the problem that you see when like organizations like DSA or Momentum or New Left organizations that are emerging, is that so many people have internalized this individualistic logic, which for them is politics, that when they try to think of problems as structural and bigger than just individuals and working together, there's often like a instinctive backlash against it because, you know, there's bad people.
Absolutely. Yeah, they have failed to kill the liberal in their head.
You have incredulity towards meta-narratives, towards like big stories of social change, and it's all replaced with individual narratives, individual struggles and difficulties.
Yeah, I think just on this subject, Adolf Reed who is one of the more aesthetic critics of this type of politics, wrote a very interesting essay. I can't remember what was published. It might have been the Baffler. Amber, you can correct me if this is wrong. Called "The Problem with Uplift" about narratives in race.
Yeah, and I sent that article to the Baffler. I was like, you should publish it in the Baffler.
And it's really quite insightful in that basically like these stories of like the person that succeeded replaced political change, and then for instance we have Barack Obama in the presidency, or like we have a woman ruling Germany like Angela Merkel, and in the meantime the conditions of women I don't know what happened in Germany, but I'm just making this up for the sake of the argument, haven't necessarily improved. They certainly didn't under Thatcher, who was a social conservative, as the conditions of black people in the United States. But this individualization of politics means if you point this out, you're attacking all black people, all women.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't think the majority of people that like
it's policing of discourse in polite spaces rather than anything that has real social traction.
Yeah, and also like the left is more tentative and meek about this than, you know, normies. I think the best definition of normies are people for whom politics are not an identity. They see it as a means to an end. If you were to say to you know, like women in the UK, like shit got way worse for women during Thatcher, they'd be like, oh yeah, obviously. But if you know, kind of discuss like, I mean, also because it just happened, like you would never say, you would never hear a leftist, you know, before, you know, some kind of largely black community group be like, you know, the decline of black wealth under Barack Obama is like, that is just empirically true, but they would be terrified to say it. However, people who aren't what you would call political are like, oh yeah, no, things got worse. There's a housing crisis. It all got shitty.
One issue I think was one that George wanted to touch on, about Firestone's approach specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned her, and I think she has been kind of resurfacing in the last few years, which I think is a fantastic development. But and maybe, you know, somebody like her might say that might question whether in this article you're going far enough. I mean, when you say if you want to socially engineer a loving and responsible masculinity, men themselves must become thoroughly optional, meaning their participation in romantic partnership or parenting would not be necessary to the financial security of either a woman or a family. I think that's definitely the case. But don't socialists, at least of some sort, also want women to be optional within a family, precisely because that's the stage that we're really looking for, when everyone is liberated from the biological constraint of women having to do the reproductive labor. And I'm not sure if if this is something that you would agree with anyway, but just wasn't in the article. But just to kind of ask that question, what's the stage beyond, I guess, kind of social democratic or welfare state approach to questions of childhood?
Right, like the post-human stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did bring up, I'm saying it with regards to women mainly because I'm in some ways addressing a feminist critique of socialism. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking about women more. But yeah, I agree, obviously, women should be able to be obsolete too. The one thing, though, about Firestone, and God bless her, because she did try and get everything to its natural conclusion, is I don't think that people are going to want robotic wombs anytime soon. Like, never mind the the technological barriers of it, which it's going to take a while. But I think actually people are kind of sentimental about their bodies. Mm-hmm. And should it be an option? Yes. Do I think many people will take advantage of it? Probably not, actually. Like, for all the bullshit, people still like old-fashioned fornication, pregnancy, and reproduction to an irrational degree, obviously.
I mean, I think it's just a sign of my cultural circles that at least in kind of cocktail or dinner party conversation, there has been the topic of robot wombs raised more frequently recently. And I mean, I guess it is a question as to whether socialists should be making this argument, because it does seem technologically quite far removed from where we're at the moment, but also maybe I mean, intellectually, I love it, but as far as someone who knows women, and those women are like, no, thank you, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. I'm gonna have an analog pregnancy.
I haven't seen this movie in like nearly 20 years. But wasn't in the Matrix like that universe full of robotic wombs?
The pods everywhere.
Or batteries too.
Yeah. Well, and people find it dystopian. They don't find it ambitious, and that's the problem. Is like when you land on a utopia that is indistinguishable from dystopia by the large majority of working class people, maybe it's not a path you actually want to push.
Well, and maybe there's some other technological advances which might feel a little bit less alienating to start with. Maybe we could just get some faster trains or something.
I certainly think
we've got robotic men on the way.
It's barbaric.
We do have robotic men on the way. I've seen those dolls.
Oh, yeah. Well, God. Who is the market? I'm genuinely curious. Who is the market?
Well, there's ever weirder niches and corners of the internet to be sold to, so I guess you'd be surprised. It's some sort of version of Rule 34. Like, if you can think of it, there'll be some product to be sold to them.
This is pure fetish. Yeah. All of the mechanics of men with none of the charm. Someone's into that.
The historical justification of capitalism is the creation of new needs. So maybe we will.
That's progress.
Sure.
Yeah. Maybe.
All right, guys, that is brilliant. Thank you very much, Amber. That was fascinating. We covered a huge amount of ground. We are back really soon with more on these similar issues. We are talking about modern relationships with Anna Khachiyan next time up. Thanks again to Amber. Catch you later. Bye-bye.